Hello, Western Civ 104. You know, I was looking at the material we covered for this week and the discussions that we were having about St. Augustine's argument for justifications of war or not, and the same with the Quran and Muslims. And so I just, because this is such a hot topic in terms of debates about, is religion good or bad, what is the role in religion contributing to or preventing violence? And I did a discussion of my thoughts on this in my announcement, but I just wanted to elaborate on a few extra points that I think, that you might find interesting and thoughtful just to say. So, first of all, I wanted to point out that you look at paganism. Let's just focus on, since we're talking about Western civilization, Germanic and Celtic religion that was before Christianity took root into Europe. So it's true that mainly, although not only, Christianity solidifies itself in the Western world through the violence of the state enforcing it and making it a reality. But Islam is in the same boat in terms of, if you look at the history of Christianity and Islam and how conversion took place, it's not always through violence, and yet at the same time, much of it has been, and that's just a reality. Now, the religions before Islam and Christianity also had violence. If you look at, let's just take the religion of the Vikings, or we'll just call it Norse religion, because not everybody in the Nordic countries were Vikings, but they still followed the Norse gods. Now, we have limited information on them, as I've discussed, but the one of the higher heavens to go to, or the best results of afterlife, is to die in battle. And in Valhalla, or Valhalla, as it's more commonly known, what happens is that there's a big feast going on, and then the men all fight and kill each other, and then get resurrected and do it all over again. So the idea of warfare and killing in the as far as we understand it, in terms of looking at the conceptual framework of Germanic paganism in Europe, was very much into warfare and thinking of it as something that in which Odin and Thor would be invoked to help them win battles, right? And then they're going to go, and if ideally to die and just keep fighting. So that's a very martial set of belief systems. And what about Jews and Judaism? Keeping in mind that Judaism focused strictly on what Christians call the Old Testament. Now, this is interesting. I have this book, Saadia Gaon, the Book of Beliefs and Opinions. He was a 9th century Jewish philosopher that was rooted in Baghdad in Iraq. But he made some commentaries. I don't know if you all realize this, but the Old Testament does talk about the ancient Israelites going and killing women and children, that God is asking them to do that in certain parts, at certain times, like in the land of Canaan, for example. And this is a little bit of a hard one for Jews and Christians to handle. The Quran has nothing like this, nor any other holy book that I've read. But this is the response that Saadia Gaon had to this. He said, "Again, we are confronted by the fact that God, the just, ordered the killing of the young children of the Midianites and the extermination of the young children of the generation of the deluge." He's talking about the flood. So what he's saying is, not only these battles, but God even had this great flood, Noah's Ark, that story, right? Killing infants and children that we're assuming would not be guilty of. Why should they be punished for grown-ups' behaviors, right? And then it says, we note also how he, referring to God, continually causes pain and even death to the little babies. Now, this is what he's really talking about, is that for Judaism, the belief is there's not really a focus on Satan as much as that God is responsible for everything. So what he's saying is, if God's responsible for everything, then we're also disturbed, understandably, by the idea that children that die and suffer, God gets responsibility for that as well. So then he says, logical necessity therefore demands that there exist after death a state in which they would obtain compensation for the pain suffered prior thereto, as we have explained. And he has some other thoughts to go into this. Now, whether this works for you or not is not. I'm mainly. What I'm saying is I don't know if this works for you or not, and I'm not really promoting this argument, but I'm simply showing that for a very long time, thinkers of theology, when it comes to the world in a state of warfare and violence and suffering and all these things, have put some thought into trying to work out where God and humans relate in this unfortunate aspect of human drama. Okay? That's the point that I'm really trying to point out. Now, if you look at the New Testament, the story of Jesus in the gospel, he does talk about turning the other cheek. But let me ask you this. When 9/11 happened, George Bush on his election campaign said that his favorite philosopher is Jesus Christ. And I think he's sincere in believing that. He seems to be sincerely into evangelical Christianity. I think most people would agree that. Whether they agreed with his interpretation of it or not, it's not the point. But wouldn't that mean then that when 9/11 happens, that if we're following the Christian teaching of turning the other cheek, according to Jesus' words, then we would not respond by blowing up somebody else's buildings? But that's what we did. And the majority of Christians in this country, let's be honest, supported that idea. Now, how would they find justifications for that theologically? Many are going to go to the Old Testament, because the Old Testament, the Hebrew Aramaic scriptures, does justify warfare in defense of one's nations. And there is a historic precedent, as we saw with St. Augustine, at least from the Catholic side, of having just or unjust wars. So it's a complicated thing that's not so straightforward by just simply saying that the text says one thing and henceforth this is what is going to happen or are going to be the results of a society in regarding violence and war, if you all feel what I'm saying. Okay? And I want you to think about this too. Okay, my name is Joshua. My parents were pacifist Christian hippies, and they broke away from the hippie part and became more devout Christians, but remained pacifists. Now, why would they name me after a war general? So Joshua is one of the most violent war-like characters that you could pick. Not the only, but he's the top one. If you look at the book of Joshua, it is about him leading Israel to make a violent conquest of the land of Canaan. So how does this work? Now, the theology that my parents had, and some pacifist Christians that I know, argue that there was a time that God had what they viewed as just wars, even if we don't understand it as just, or like how it could be just to kill children and take land from other people by one nation, right? And so what they say is that that's time-specific situations where God was directly intervening in human affairs by using prophets And since God made life, he has a right to take life, and then he knows best. That was the plan at the time. And then when Jesus comes, the role for people following God is to no longer go by the Mosaic law, like the law that the Jews had to follow, and to no longer be a participant in political and military affairs, but to focus on preaching the gospel. That's the argument that they made in this particular branch of Christianity. And there's similar pacifist Christians that's made the same kind of arguments. But I have a lot of Christian friends and family who are devout and heavily involved in being American nationalists and involved in American wars. And they focus on the Old Testament. There does seem to be a contradiction that many see, is the New Testament passive, peaceful side, because even the works of Paul talk about, in Romans, you will return evil for evil to no one. Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. How does this fit in? This is not something that's easy for Christians to resolve. It's a debate that happens within Christianity itself. For Muslims, there is something called nasikh wal mansukh. And this is a very famous method for, well, famous, what I mean is that this is, for Islamic scholars, this term would be very immediately understood. Not necessarily every Muslim person that I know knows this term. It's something that you know if you are studying scholarship on the Quran. The Quran is not in chronological order, and it doesn't have much narrative. It's not an easy book to follow if you read it and try to get the Bible really kind of starts with in the beginning, makes it very easy, right? And then it ends in the Christian New Testament of most Christians, except for the Assyrian Church of the East, with the revelation, the end of the world, Armageddon, right? And it kind of feels, it has a chronological flow. You feel like you're starting somewhere and going somewhere. The Quran does not work like that. So it starts with Surat al-Fatiha, the opening, like the prayer that they say all the time, kind of like our Lord's Prayer for Christianity. And then it goes largest book to smallest. And this method of nasikh wal mansukh means the abrogating verse and the abrogated verse. Okay, so what does this mean? There are verses in the Quran that the scholars of Islam look and they said, this is a very time-specific verse that has a very specific context to it. It is not a universally applicable verse. And another verse later on actually clarifies that and elaborates something different, which is universal. And so the other verse is something you have to understand was just time specific. So there's a verse in the Quran that says you should not be drinking alcohol, intoxicants while praying. That implies that when you pray, you can drink, but just not while you're praying. But then another verse follows later on, completely forbidding intoxicants. And so the Islamic scholars would say that's the verse that Muslims are supposed to follow. When it comes to some of the texts about relationship of Muslims with Jews and Christians, with pagans and war and violence, this method gets used the same way. So in a sense, the Muslims have a more systematic setup for how to deal with what outsiders would see as contradictions than the way that Christians do dealing with the Old Testament versus the New Testament. I'm not actually trying to make a defense and say that Muslims are doing it better. I'm simply saying that they have a more thought out system in place. But there still can be disagreements about which verse is actually abrogated or not. So just one example, and I'll end this lecture's little added announcement lecture. There's a verse that says you must not become friends with Jews and Christians. But the word friend, it's usually the word in English, friend is really not that precise. The word is derives from wali, which means more like protector. Now, most Islamic scholars are basically arguing that there was a battle and there was conflict at the time between some of the Arab Christian tribes and Jewish Christian tribes, and the Muslims were told not to rely on protection, essentially, from Jews or Christians. And so this is a time-specific battle that does not mean universally Muslims cannot be friends with Jews and Christians. Now, for some of the more Islamic militant groups like Al-Qaeda and maybe ISIS types, they might try to find that verse as it nicely fits into a much more universal justification to be more anti the other, right? And then ultimately, what I just want to point out again is that the majority of any given society, if you look historically, just wants to live in peace and will do just that. And it's the people in power or radical political or religious groups that mobilize people to try to whip them up and use these traditions to justify a particular political or ideological vision, if you get what I'm saying. I mean, Buddhism is officially pacifist as well in many ways, but Buddhist history is full of warrior kings and wars. And if you look in Myanmar right now, they've expelled through violence and rape and torture about close to about 1 million or over 500,000 Rohingya Muslims. There are Hindu patrols in parts of India that terrorize Muslims. So it doesn't really matter. Like I think that what I'm trying to make is that historically all of these traditions have found a very safe place and a very easy way to use their religious traditions and their texts to justify doing what any nation state would do, or any revolutionary group, so on and so forth. And you have people who want to promote the idea of their religion and faith being peaceful and something that is good for a harmonious society, and they can equally find ways to make those traditions fit into that as well. So I hope that I provided some source of information that would maybe help clarify some of this topic. If you have any disagreement with what I'm saying, or you want to contribute something to that, this discussion, please feel free to make a comment on the announcement page, or to write me personally if you would like. Shlama, shalom, salam, peace. And we'll be in touch if you need anything. Like, again, let me know, and have a great weekend.